What up, YouTube? This is your boy, Adam of NOLA, and this is my channel, Skepticus. And today we're going to do something a little different. I spend a lot of time, pretty much all of my time on this channel, kind of tearing down religion and Christianity and the Bible, because a lot of times it really deserves a lot of tearing down, let's be honest. But in the spirit of fairness, in the spirit of intellectual honesty, and hopefully in the spirit of making some interesting content, I thought it would be interesting today to not be tearing down so much as building up. What I mean by that is that if you are trying to engage with someone's argument, you can yell and scream, you can try to take down all their logical points, you can try to bulldoze over them. I mean, you can do a lot of tactics that are fair or unfair, depending on the perspective. But one of the more edifying things that you can do is to not tear them down, but try to build them up. Or to put it a different way, perhaps try to steelman their argument. I think that if you're steelmanning someone's argument as opposed to strawmanning it, it at a minimum makes you more educated on your opponent's point of view. It tends to inspire empathy because you have to put yourself in their shoes. And of course, I was a Christian for 40 years, so it's not like I have to make these things up. But I thought it would be interesting to look at some of these arguments for Christianity and try to figure out how would I defend them now. Now, if you haven't seen some of my other videos and you don't know, I was a Christian for 40 years before finally deciding this isn't for me. I don't believe this anymore. I haven't believed it in a while. And now I'm pretty much hard capital A atheist, meaning I don't just disbelieve. I really don't think there's a God there at all. I don't think that there's anything to Christianity, etc. But that being said, I never want to come across as just someone who says, it's all crap, you're all stupid, how could anyone follow this? I mean, I was a Christian for 40 years. You might be a Christian right now watching this video. So I think that it's somewhat instructive and helpful to try to think, I don't want to say opponent's point of view, to try to think from someone else's point of view and say, how would I answer these things now? So what I did is on my channel, I could go out and find 1,000 arguments for Christianity off the top of my head and also just from various internet lists or what have you. But to kind of get a synopsis of a handful of good arguments or bad arguments, if you will, I put out a post on my own channel and said, hey, give me some of your worst defenses of Christianity. And you guys delivered. I have a decent list here of things to go through. Before I dive into these, just a couple quick ground rules so you understand what it is that I am and am not doing, okay? First of all, I am not a fan of apologetics. I was a Christian for 40 years, and now I kind of despise a lot of the stock answers that Christians give to support some of their crazier ideas. So I'm not here in this video just to regurgitate to you the apologist talking points. I know for everything that we're going to talk about what most of the apologist talking points would be, but I don't think that there's a lot of value probably to you as a viewer and not to me as a content creator and just regurgitating those back to you. However, I also don't want to say, here's this bad argument for Christianity and here's why it's stupid. That's the opposite of what we're doing in this video. So instead, I've challenged myself here to say, okay, I'm not a Christian anymore. I don't believe that Yahweh is there. I don't believe that Jesus was the Son of God. Nevertheless, knowing what I know now, what is the best argument that I can put forth in defense of these talking points? So I am going to attempt in good faith to give my best arguments on behalf of these Christian defenses. There's still going to be a little bit of massaging of points here because, again, I don't believe in Christianity. So I have to come up with the best way that I can think of that's logically defensible, that doesn't just dismiss these Christian talking points. So that's what we're doing. So the first bad defense for Christianity, and I don't want you to take bad the wrong way, but bad meaning maybe an atheist would think that this is logically inconsistent. But the first defense of Christianity that I'm going to try to embrace is essentially the argument from personal experience. Of course, this is very big in any religion. Christianity is no different because at the end of the day, I can show you all of this stuff from my holy text and I can tell you what the church leaders say you have to do. But people want to feel personally connected to their religion, to their God, to whatever the tenets are of their faith. And usually, often, they do that through personal experience. Now, obviously, the atheist retort or the skeptic's retort to this is to say, your personal experience, anecdotal evidence, it's not evidence at all. And I could give you a long litany of reasons why even experiences that you believe you've had about God and Jesus and faith and all that may or may not be true. But again, that's not my point here. So if I have to defend one's argument from personal experience, here's how I think that I would do that. First, let's keep in mind that religion in general, or theism in general, I should say, and specifically Christianity, of course, has a God proposition that is unprovable and unfalsifiable. This is central to basically every theistic tradition that I've ever seen. They have someone up there in the clouds or in the universe or something, and we can't prove that he's there, but we also can't disprove him. Keeping that in mind, I'm not going to tear down that fact. That's just a feature of theism, if you will. But if we are going to accept that there are religious people and that religion brings meaning to some people's lives and that they truly believe it, and we also understand that the God proposition itself, and for that matter, many of the tenets of faith themselves, are both unprovable and unfalsifiable, what that also means then is it tends to amplify the importance or the gravitas of personal experience. In other words, when you are operating in an arena where nothing is provable and nothing is falsifiable, then of course personal experience feels more meaningful, more powerful. If I said to you that we're going to go into a court of law and we're going to be arguing a very detailed forensic case about why a particular crime occurred, and then I said in the middle of that detailed forensic analysis, I was going to interject a whole bunch of data points about how I felt about the crime, I think you would understand that doesn't fit. It's a bad argument and it's a non sequitur when placed alongside the rest of the evidence. In a similar fashion, if I was in a lab, a scientific lab, and we're making a case, we're doing these hard science experiments with high-tech instruments and very fine-grained measurements, and we're creating this very detailed paper that we're going to submit for peer review. And in the middle of this highly detailed, highly technical paper, I said, I'm going to inject a bunch of my personal experiences and my personal feelings, which experiences, feelings, kind of the same thing. I said, I'm going to inject a bunch of anecdotal experiences. I think you would understand that doesn't fit. But if I said to you, we're going to make a case for God, the Bible, Jesus, any other aspect of Christianity, which at most is based upon words that were written in a book as no sooner than 2,000 years ago, then personal experience, I have to admit, feels more in line with this because you're dealing in an arena already that does not have empirical data behind it. Now, I know that some of the creationists or whatever are going to start squawking like, oh, we think we have all this empirical data. And for that, I can just say, shut up. And I know I'm trying to steelman arguments here, but I can't steelman your creationism. So, but in general, I do understand and even respect the fact that religion is very real for many, many people in the world. And if we are in that arena, if we're playing in the world of non-falsifiable theistic phenomena, personal experience probably feels more powerful and more meaningful than it does in other aspects of your life. And I understand that. Even if we were to take the skeptic's view that many of these anecdotal experiences aren't nearly as convincing as you might think they are. They're not nearly as evidential or empirical as you might think that they are. That still doesn't mean that those experiences didn't happen. And it doesn't mean that when you relate to me your experiences that they're not a direct result of true feelings and emotions and sensory perceptions in your own mind. In other words, let's take it out of the arena of religion for a moment. If you told me last night that you saw a ghost, as a skeptic, I would probably be thinking in my mind, I'm not sure if you really saw a ghost, but I'm not going to sit there and tell you that you're full of crap. I'm not going to tell you that you're hallucinating. I'm not telling you that the experience that you had last night wasn't real. The experience, assuming that you're coming to me in good faith and relating to me a story that you believe happened, then I believe that the experience that you're relating was a real experience. Doesn't mean that I think that it can truly be attributed to the sources that you are attributing it to. But even if that's the case, even if what you saw or felt last night wasn't a ghost, that doesn't change the fact that you had a very real experience here. And your experience should not be completely discounted in that regard. So I can grant you that much as well. To put it very simply, every single experience that we have in our lives is, on some level, real. It's a real experience, meaning you felt something, neurons triggered. You may have seen something. You may have heard something. Now, whether or not it can be attributed to the source that you're claiming is a discussion for another time. But I don't ever want to be in the position of trying to tell people that they are lying if I can't prove that they are. And assuming that they're telling the truth, I don't ever want to be in the position of trying to tell people that your experiences are fake, that they didn't happen. In your mind, they absolutely happened. And whether or not that's God, well, I think that's pretty much an article of faith. The next argument that I'm steelmanning here is that Christianity is not a religion. It's a personal relationship with God. This gave me a little bit of pause, admittedly, because as an atheist now, when I hear this, I find it to be cringy. But in keeping with the theme of this video, I can't sit here and tear this down. I have to steelman this to the best of my ability in good faith. So let's do that. First, let's be clear. Every person has the right to define in their own mind what they see as a relationship. I know what I see as a relationship. I believe relationships require two-way communication. They require both parties to show up, not just ethereally, but physically, like to be there for you at times. But that being said, that is my definition of relationship. You can have your own definition of relationship. When we're young, we have relationships with imaginary friends and with stars that we have crushes on or that we're infatuated with. And I'm not saying that as an insult, okay? I'm not saying that to downplay your relationship with Christ, but I am saying that Just like you feel that your relationship with Christ or your relationship with Yahweh is very real and personal and moving, some people feel that their relationship with Beyonce is very real and personal and moving, even if they've never met her, or they feel that their relationship with their imaginary friends are real and personal and moving when they're young. Again, that's not meant to be nearly as dismissive as it might sound. The point is that nobody can say from the outside what your brain is perceiving as relationship. Also, I want to point out that for anyone who believes in the mind-body dichotomy, there is no empirical way to prove that the counterparty of that relationship is not God. Meaning, most Christians that I know of think that their mind is separate from their brain. That when I say mind-body dichotomy, what I mean is this idea that you have a mind and or a soul. Some people would say mind and soul are part of the same thing. Others would not. But when we say mind, we think of this non-physical thing. When we say soul, we think of this non-physical thing. And of course, when we say body, we think of this. I don't think you have to see it as purely a meat machine if you're an atheist, but I think that most atheists are more inclined to feel, to understand that your mind is a product of your physical brain. Your soul is a product, if it exists, of your physical body. But if we assume that inside the meat palace, which is my physical brain, that there's also this untouchable, unfeelable, ethereal thing called a mind, then that also means that God can be in my brain without being a part of my brain. In other words, I can say that there's this omnipresent Sky Daddy, which I guess Sky Daddy is not Steelmanning the terms, right? There's this omnipresent Abba Father that's everywhere in the universe, but he's also in my brain. He's everywhere. He's in my brain. He's standing behind me. He's sitting on my couch. He's everywhere. So if that is the case, despite the fact that many skeptics would say that this relationship with someone you can't see or touch or directly feel and seems to happen only in your head, some people would say, well, that's not a relationship at all. And yet, if we assume that your brain holds things other than just physical synapses and electrical circuitry, if we assume that your brain also is the seat of a mind and also somehow deeply related to a soul, then how can we say definitively that this relationship, even if it only exists in your head, is still not a relationship with God? The next thing we're going to steelman is the Trinity. And I have to admit, I should have put up the names of the people who put these on here. I'll put them on the screen when I'm doing this. This one really almost borderline pissed me off when I saw someone put this, because I'm expecting to see a bunch of comments for truly bad arguments for Christianity that I have to defend, right? And yet I wasn't expecting someone to say just the Trinity. And I looked at that and I thought, oh, you son of a bitch. Like, how the hell am I supposed to steelman the Trinity? And I'm saying this because even as a Christian, the Trinity never made any damn sense to me. Three gods, but they're one God, but they're not the same, but they are one. Like, none of that makes any sense. But fine, I have to find a way to steelman this. And again, even when I was Christian, I couldn't find a really good way to articulate this. And quite frankly, I don't know if I've ever heard another Christian articulate this in a good way either, because it always comes down to some touchy-feely crap like, oh, you know, his ways are bigger than our ways. We can't understand the mystery of God, which is just a total cop-out. And I don't want to do that. If we're just going to do that, we can just forego this whole exercise. So for something that I never even thought made a ton of sense when I was a Christian, and I sure as hell don't think it makes sense now, How do I steelman this? I figured it out. Omnipresence. Think about this. Now, I at times have scoffed at this Christian notion of omnipresence because sometimes the Bible seems to contradict that along with all the other omnis. But let's grant that. Let's grant that Yahweh is there. Yahweh is all the omnis. He's omnipresent, omnibenevolent, omniscient, omnipotent, etc. But most importantly for this discussion, he's omnipresent. Why does that matter with regard to the Trinity? Well, if we assume that he had a son and that his son either became or is divine, again, these get into all sorts of theological discussions, but let's just say his son is divine, right? His son is not God. So how can he be divine and do things that God can do without being God, but still somehow be one? And we can repeat the same argument for the Holy Spirit. So whether we're talking about Jesus or the Holy Spirit or Yahweh himself, how can there be three and be one? Well, I would steelman it like this. If Yahweh is truly omnipresent, then he is everywhere. He's sitting in the room with you. He's looking down at you from up there while he's sitting in the room with you. He's also, standing out on the sidewalk while he's sitting in the room with you, while he's looking down from up there. I mean, if he's truly omnipresent, that means he has all perspectives on all things at any moment in time. So truly, in many respects, it is not wrong from a theological perspective to say that if I'm not God, at least God is truly in me at all times. Now, I know some Christians don't want to hear you say that if you said that you're an atheist, right? Or let's take it a step further. Let's say I'm a demon. Let's say I'm just evil. Let's say I'm bad. Let's say I'm Hitler. Well, God, if he's truly omnipresent, was in Hitler all the time, every minute, every second of the day. God was in every part of Hitler. God's in every part of me. God's in every part of every person in the world because God is, according to the more modern Greek interpretation, and by modern, I mean 2,000 years ago, he's everywhere. He's omnipresent. He's all the omnis, right? Well, the reason this is important is because if I have a son that I have created who's also divine, and I have this Holy Spirit that's out there, it's also a divine thing, okay? At all times, Jesus is, if not God, is filled with God because God is omnipresent. At all times, the Holy Spirit, if not God, is at least filled with God because God is omnipresent. And now, like I say, you could argue that this isn't the greatest steelmanning because by that same token, it makes it sound like I'm part of the Trinity, the quadrinity or whatever. And it makes it sound like you're part of the Trinity. And it makes it sound like Hitler's part of the Trinity. I don't know. But this is the most logical answer that I can come up with for how you have three divine beings. And see, that's the reason I would say it's different than saying that I'm part of the Trinity, because even if God is in me, I'm not divine. Okay. Even if God was in Hitler, well, Hitler was never divine. If God's in any human, that's different than any of us being divine. But Jesus, according to Christian doctrine, was and or is divine. The Holy Spirit, according to Christian doctrine, is divine. So you have three divine entities that all have God in them at all times because God, Yahweh, the Father, is omnipresent. So that is how I would steelman the Trinity. The next item that we are steelmanning is hell. The person who put this didn't even say like, oh, try to steelman this argument for hell or what have you. They just said hell. Okay, I have already spent time on this channel talking about hell at length, talking about why I don't think it's real, just like the rest of Christianity, why I'm not afraid of it, etc. But let's look at things from a few practical perspectives, from Christian perspectives, okay? But first, I will freely admit to you that when you hear an atheist or skeptic or even just someone of another religion try to tear down the Judeo-Christian concept of hell, I think that there are normally two things that they focus on. The first item that they focused on is the injustice of it. Okay. The whole idea of how is it that I could burn in hell, eternal conscious torment, because I had some unforgiven sins. No matter how minor those sins were. I stole a loaf of bread. Okay. And then, okay, so now I'm going to have eternal conscious torment alongside Hitler. How does that make sense? They will dive into the blatant injustice of it 12 different ways. And I've done this myself because the injustice of it is very real and very tangible. So that is the first thing that they focus on. The second thing, I think it's a little more nuanced, but if you understand the history of the Old Testament and the New Testament and hell and Sheol and the way that these religions were influenced by the Persians and then later by the Greeks and all this, you start to see hell evolving, not so much as an actual place that we go to, but more as a doctrine, as a theological construct that evolved in time, starting way back from Genesis and changing and morphing in an almost continual manner right up through Revelation. And that evolution, this shifting of what hell even is and what happens to our souls after we die, tends to undercut its credibility in the minds of a lot of people, because if hell's a thing, you just think, well, that's not going to change over time. Hell's going to be hell. So we tend to attack it based on issues of injustice, and we tend to attack it based on issues of historical fidgeting that they're doing to keep tweaking the concept of hell. But the simple way to steelman this, if I want to be as Christian as I can be, is this. Regardless of whether you think it's just, regardless of whether you think the concept evolved over time, the real question is just, is Christianity real? Meaning, does Yahweh exist? Is Jesus his son, etc.? And if he is real, then does hell exist? And is hell real? And are the prescriptions for how we get sent there true? Because ultimately, and this is a kind of a crappy way to take it, but I think that it really is a form of steelmanning. Ultimately, if hell's there and these are the rules that God gave you, it doesn't matter if our conception of it evolved over time. It doesn't matter if it's incredibly unjust according to our standards. All that matters is that it's there, and if you don't do right, you're going to burn in hell. And if you don't want to burn in hell for the rest of eternity, you follow his laws. End of story. That simple. Of course, as an atheist and a skeptic, I have plenty of issues with that approach, but I will be the first one to admit to you that if we were to grant the truth of Christianity, meaning the existence of Yahweh and Jesus and the Holy Spirit, and we also then granted the existence of hell, then it doesn't really matter if it's just, does it? It doesn't matter if it makes any sense to you. It doesn't matter if your little grandma, who was always nice to everyone and treated everyone like gold, but she never accepted Jesus into her heart. It doesn't matter if she's going to burn for all eternity right next to Hitler. All that matters is apparently you know that you have to accept Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior and repent your sins and confess him with your mouth and blah, blah, blah. And therefore, you will escape the flames. That is the very brutal, very practical, and somewhat steelmanning way to look at it. Now, there is one other pretty good steelman argument that I can give you here, but it depends on your reading of the Bible and your own theology. This is actually the approach that I took for most of my time as a Christian. I don't know exactly when my views on hell changed, but I can tell you that pretty early in my life, the eternal conscious torment crowd just didn't seem to make a whole hell of a lot of sense to me. But there's another way to look at it, to interpret it, to see the eternal afterlife. And that is to look at it as not eternal or conditionally eternal. What I'm talking about is annihilationism. I think one good way to steelman hell is to say, well, some people that were especially bad might go there to be tortured, or maybe there just isn't a hell. And maybe what's actually happening is that if you've done right, if you ticked the boxes for Jeebus, you will go to heaven. You will be in eternal joy, in the grace of God for the rest of eternity. And if you didn't, you'll just go away. I'm not going to get into all the details of this right here. There is biblical basis for the idea of annihilationism. The problem is that there's also a lot of biblical basis for the idea of eternal conscious torment. And you can get in long discussions or debates with biblical scholars and apologists about which approach is right or which one's the most biblical. I do think if we're just going to count up verses, count up references, it does seem that eternal conscious torment wins, if we want to call it that. But that being said, I'm not trying to get into a big deep dive here in this video on annihilationism versus eternal conscious torment. But I do think that if you can read the Bible and come out of it with a reading that supports annihilationism, then annihilationism is a far stronger steelman for hell or the idea of hell than saying, oh yeah, you're a great person, but you never accepted Jesus, and therefore you're going to burn in hell forever. Screw you. Our next steelman is the idea that God is a war criminal. Of course, we're not steelmanning the idea that God's a war criminal, but essentially we need to steelman the conquests, the slaughters, and the genocides that are in some cases described in the Bible, and I'm talking mostly about the Old Testament here, and in some cases are prescribed by Yahweh himself. So how do we steelman that? Well, I've got a good answer for you, or at least I have the best answer that I think I could come up with at any point now or in the future. And the answer is very simple. It may sound a little blunt, maybe a little cruel, but let's be perfectly honest about this. Yahweh is not everyone's God. Now, you might say he's the only God and therefore he's the God of everyone, but saying he's the God of the universe is a lot different than saying he's my God. Okay? You understand the distinction there? You know, if the universe has a God and it's only one God, then you could argue that, okay, in theory, he's all our God. However, if we don't worship him, or if he doesn't care about us or want us to worship him, then it's hard to say that he's really our God. He's a God. You can say he's the God, but to be our God, there really needs to be this kind of agreement between deity and the worshiper that says, hey, I'm your God. And the worshiper says, yes, you're my God. And boom, it's a match made in heaven, pun intended. In the Old Testament, it is painfully clear that Yahweh, while you can argue that he's the only God of the universe, and in theory, then that makes him the only God that anyone can follow successfully, it is still painfully clear that he is not everyone's God, nor does he even want to be everyone's God. He refers to the Hebrews and then eventually the Israelites repeatedly as his people, his chosen people, and yes, even his slaves. But the point is that they are his people. All of the rules, the commandments, the directions that he lays down for them in the Old Testament are specifically just for them, just for the Israelites. He doesn't say that everyone in the world should get circumcised. He never even suggests that idea. I mean, maybe you could argue he doesn't do it because the rest of the world would have said, screw you. But the simple fact is, He never even hints at the idea that they should all get circumcised. He never hints at the idea that they should all come to the tabernacle and worship. He never hints at any kind of global dominion, even if he may assert multiple times in the Bible his superiority or even oneness, as we hear in the Shema. The simple fact is, he only really cares about the Israelites. You can see this writ large in passages like Exodus, where he doesn't care who he afflicts in Egypt. For example, he is freeing the Israelite slaves, but it specifically says in some of the passages that the plagues that he is bringing upon the Egyptians will also affect the other Egyptian slaves that are not Israelites. Now, there's nothing that an Egyptian slave could have done to have deserved this kind of punishment, because the other slaves, the non-Israelite slaves in Egypt, they weren't holding the Israelites there. They were slaves just like the Israelites, and yet God didn't care. The plagues were going to affect everyone. Now, you may think it doesn't sound like I'm steelmanning it, but what I'm saying here is that for better or worse, the God of the Old Testament is absolutely, unequivocally the God of the Hebrews, the God of the Israelites, even to the extent that he doesn't really care about anyone else. He doesn't care about slaughtering them. He doesn't care about calling for their elimination. And yes, I know you can say, well, some of that sounds like hyperbole, because then these ethnic groups that are supposed to be eliminated pop up again in the narrative later. But he doesn't seem to care in the edicts that he lays down for his own people. Even when you go to the New Testament, and especially after the crucifixion, and you start to get into the letters, the books written by Paul and such, you have this proselytizing that's going on. Even then, there's a strong case to be made that while you could say he's the only God, and therefore by default the God for all of us, he's not really your God if you're following someone else. The Gentiles that were converted and that became Christians, okay, those now are his people, right? They're kind of like the new Israelites. They're the converted Hebrews, if you will. They're like the ones tacked on to the old group that was favored. So at least in the New Testament, you can say, well, you have the ability now to be one of God's people according to choice. But if you don't believe me on this, let me just ask you, if you've been praying all day to Vishnu, is Yahweh looking out for you? Is Yahweh acting on your behalf? Is he interceding to help you in your life? Now, I know you could argue maybe even for Christians, he's not actively interceding, but would he intercede to help you if all you do all day long is pray to Vishnu? I don't think he would. So the point is that even if he is the only God of the universe, he's not actively everyone's God. In order to be his disciple, his person, you have to acknowledge him and worship him. I'm just bringing this up because while it's pretty damn cold, and I'm not going to try to defend genocide or any type of slaughter in the Old Testament, I think that the best way that you can think about it, that you can present it, is just that God is looking out for his people, even at the expense of everyone else. He's looking out for his people according to the narrative, and he doesn't care who has to die to make way for his people. Now, I could also tell you plenty of times when he seemed to do horrible things to his own people, but we're Steelmanning. So let's just stay with that. All right. So that is the best Steelmanning that I can give for this idea that God supposedly advocates for war crimes. Well, when it's us versus them in the most dire of circumstances, at some point, everything's on the table if all you care about is removing the other group. I'm not saying that you should ever want to remove the other group, but if that's all you care about, then I guess everything's on the table. How would you like to be one of my advisors? I'm using Skepticus's memberships as a way to allow you to have a voice in the content and the direction of this channel. I hope to see you in the membership pool, and I want to hear your voice in what Skepticus is doing going forward. The next argument here to Steelman is that all prayers are answered, but sometimes the answer is maybe or no. I'm sure whether you're a Christian or an atheist or anywhere in between, you've probably heard this before, right? Because we're supposed to pray, we're supposed to bring our problems to Jesus or to God. And when we pray, we have this idea that on some level our prayers are answered, and yet sometimes we don't see any answer. How do we deal with that? Well, one of the ways that we deal with that rhetorically is we say, well, all the prayers are answered, but sometimes the answer is no. And I can, on the surface, without getting too much into this, I can steelman that very easily, because in the big wide world of humanity, even amongst people who are Christians, who are trying to do the right thing, who have given their life to Christ, and they're trying to be the best Christian that they can be, inevitably, there are going to be some times when those good Christians pray for some really bad things. Maybe you're trying to be the best Christian that you can, but this person has been screwing with you for 10 years, and today they did something that just finally put you over the edge. And in a fit of rage, you get on your knees and you pray to Jesus to please strike this person dead or burn down their house or, do some other horrible thing. So, of course, in those scenarios, the answer, I would hope, would be no. Of course, on a more nuanced level, there are times when we pray for things that we think are good. We think we're helping, maybe not even ourselves, maybe our neighbors and friends by praying for these things, but they may not really be good. Maybe your friend is, fearing that he's going to lose his job. So you get on your knees and you pray, God, please help him to keep his job. And he loses his job. And you think, wow, God didn't answer that prayer at all. But, a few years later, your friend tells you, yeah, that job was really bad for me. And I was not happy and I wasn't doing it well. And losing that job woke me up and allowed me then to pursue a new career or get into a better company or whatever. There's always those times when we see a prayer which was not answered or was answered no. And then in retrospect, we say, wow, I'm glad that God didn't answer that prayer. So that's actually pretty easy for me to steelman. The only part of that I can't steelman is that the answer, I think most Christians are pretty reasonable in this. They understand what I've just said. They've understood that, of course, you can't have this expectation that everything I ask God for gets answered. I don't care how righteous you are. I don't care how much you are looking out for everyone else in the world. At some point, you got to pray for something that just can't get answered, even if we assume that God's listening and answering all your prayers. So I don't think that most Christians have a problem with the idea that the answer is no. The problem comes from the fact that we just don't get an answer. Even when the answer is yes, we're just assuming it's yes because the thing that we prayed for happened. Like in that example I gave, your friend is afraid he's going to lose his job. So you pray for him to keep his job. And it turns out he keeps his job. And the boss who was really pissed off with him leaves the company and he ends up getting promoted. And that seems like an answer to prayer, right? But other times we pray for something and it just feels like there's silence. It feels like there's not a no, there's not a yes, there's not a maybe, there's nothing coming back to us. That's the part that's pretty hard to deal with. I mean, that's referred to as the problem of hiddenness, but that isn't what we're steelmanning here. So this is my answer to the steelman. Of course, sometimes the answer is going to be no, because people ask for some jacked up shit. So the next thing that we're defending or steelmanning is anytime a child or someone young dies and a person says they're in a better place. My defense of this I think has to be very situational. Okay. Anytime you are dealing, with someone, a friend, family member, whoever, who has experienced tragedy, loss of a loved one, the burning down of their house, like anything like that. The first thing you always have to remember, regardless of whether they're Christian or Buddhist or Muslim or atheist or whatever, is you have to understand the person that you're trying to console. And if you don't understand them, by all means, be careful about how you're consoling someone. Because sometimes, I think especially when you're trying to console somebody, you can really say the wrong thing really fast. And you can take what was meant to be, in your head, a comforting phrase, and it can turn very bad very quickly. I mean, if my house is burned down and you come to me and you say, oh, my thoughts and prayers are with you, I'm just going to say, I may not say it to your face, but I'm going to be thinking, shut the hell up. I don't want to hear about your thoughts and prayers. I want to hear if you want to come over and help me rebuild the house. I want to hear if you want to donate a little money so that I can, hopefully, pull it together and build a new house. But if your response is thoughts and prayers and my response is go screw yourself, really, I mean, I have no interest in your thoughts and prayers. But that's me, okay? Some people may want to hear that. Some people may like to hear that you're giving them your thoughts and prayers. The same thing, much larger scale, applies to when you've lost a loved one. And the same thing on an even larger scale applies to when you lost someone who's young, a child, a baby, etc. I mean, that is such a horrific period of grieving that you just have to be very, very careful about what you say. And this applies to whether they're Christian, whether they're a different religion, whether they're atheists, it doesn't matter. And if you have any doubts whatsoever, don't try to comfort them in that way. I would say, just say to them, how can I help? Or can I come cook you dinner? Or, whatever. But if you're not even sure, if you don't know what it is that's going to comfort them, then tread lightly, my friend. Because in those periods of grief, sometimes even what seems like this nice, saccharine, comforting comment can come across very wrong. But I will say this, I do appreciate that when you've gone through that kind of tragedy and someone's trying to tell you something like they're in a better place, I know they think that they are helping. They think that they're saying the right thing. But again, just know that your words are not necessarily wrong. This is my Steelmanning it, okay? But make sure that your words are targeted towards someone who's going to appreciate them as such. So this next one is kind of funny to me. Someone asked me to steelman the idea that Catholicism is sane. Now, I spent a lot of time, attacking religion and theism and Christianity. I haven't really done any deep dives on Catholicism per se. And admittedly, I spent a lot of time talking about American evangelicism and fundamentalism because it's pertinent to where I live. But I do actually have some layman's experience in the Catholic Church. My family on my father's side was Catholic. I was raised in a Protestant tradition, but I spent a lot of time with my grandparents on my father's side that I was very close to. I usually spent weekends out there, sometimes for many months on end. And every time I would wake up on a Sunday morning, well, my grandma and grandpa were going to mass, and you can bet that they dragged me to mass every single time. For a while, I was even in the Catholic youth group because I was living with them for a little while. So my point is, more so than some Protestant-raised people, I have a fair amount of experience with the Catholic Church. So I thought it was funny that somebody would ask me to steelman the idea that Catholicism is sane. I mean, here's the easy low-hanging fruit that's like damning someone with faint praise. I don't think that Catholicism is any worse than Protestantism at large. I can pick out Protestant denominations, and I can pick out Protestant doctrines, and I can say, okay, this is better or this is worse than Catholicism. But in general, even when I was a Christian, I was never this person who thought that Catholics were going to hell, or I never thought that Catholicism was wrong. There were aspects of Catholicism I thought were weird, to say the least. But that's not the point of this video. So I guess as a means of steelmanning Catholicism, let me give you what I think are some of Catholicism's strongest points, because it does have some things going for it. First of all, it's the OG, all right, for whatever that's worth. I mean, whether or not that makes it better or more right is subject of deep theological debate, but, there wasn't Protestantism for a long time, right? There was just Catholicism, although I know that splintered with Orthodoxy and such. But the point is that was the OG. In some respects, you have to give it a certain amount of deference in saying, hey, they were the first real formalized incarnation of the church. And as such, I think that they have a good understanding of Christianity. I don't think that their ideas are bad. I mean, again, some of their ideas I could whittle away on, but that's not the point of this video. More importantly to me, I do appreciate the fact that Catholicism has a hierarchical, centralized governing body. I'm not saying that the governing body always does the right thing. I'm not saying that even if I wanted to be a Catholic, that I would agree with everything that the governing body does. The governing body has had scandals. They've had, the whole child molestation thing, which is horrific. And they've had popes who were corrupt and all of that. Part of that's just inevitable because men, humans. But I do appreciate the fact that there is this centralized formal structure in Catholicism, because one of the things I find a little frustrating with Protestantism in general is this constant sniping about who's a real Christian and who's not, and whether or not you have to be baptized or not to be a Christian, and whether or not you have to believe in the Trinity or not to be a Christian. And there are so many different factions of Protestantism, and sometimes even within those factions, there's all this sniping going on that it can be hard at times to get any type of definitive judgment on, look, this is what we're doing. This is the rule. This is what we're going to follow. And if you don't believe it, then you're not in the group anymore. Now, Christians will try to do that. They'll try to say, oh, this is absolutely part of Christianity. And if you don't believe that, you're not a Christian. But the sad part is that these Christians, these arrogant pricks who want to promote this stuff, they don't have the authority to tell you that. But within a body like Catholicism, Catholics can't tell you that you're not a Christian, although many will try. They can absolutely say you're not a Catholic anymore. They can say you've been excommunicated. They can say you're a heretic. Now, that's full of a lot of BS in the history of the church as well. But at least you have this central authority. And at times, I do wish that sometimes some of these fly-by-night non-denominational or evangelical churches that spring up, these mega churches that don't seem to report to anybody, I wish that they had more of a centralized body that could, in theory, rein them in. I think that this leads to more consistent messaging in Catholicism. Now, I'm not trying to claim by any stretch of the imagination that Catholicism is a single unified body, right? Of course, there are debates even within Catholicism, people wanting to have this doctrine or not, and people feeling like this pope was good and others don't. There's always going to be factionalism happening. But I think that Catholics, due to this unified structure, are more apt to have consistent, unified messaging than almost any other denomination that you would think of, especially any other denomination in Protestantism. And finally, the last thing I'll say for Catholicism is this. I would call it the McDonald's effect. You know, when you're traveling to, I don't know, the Czech Republic, and maybe you stop in a McDonald's. I mean, I wouldn't recommend it because I think McDonald's food is crap. But a lot of people that eat at McDonald's won't even tell you that it's great food, but they still eat there. They eat there in their hometown. They eat there when they're traveling. Why do they do this? Well, because they've done studies on this, not just for McDonald's, but for restaurants in general. And people put a great degree of value in consistency and predictability. So generally speaking, a Big Mac is a Big Mac. And I know there are exceptions to this because there are far-flung places where even the Big Mac has different ingredients. But for the most part, you feel like when you go into a McDonald's and you get a Big Mac, you know what you're getting. That might be the lowest common denominator, but you still know what you're getting. And if we can count that as a benefit for Catholicism, I would think it would be kind of nice to know that if I moved to Argentina tomorrow, there's all sorts of things about Argentina I wouldn't understand. I've never lived there. I've never been in South America. I don't speak Spanish. You know, there'd be so much to learn. But if I was a Catholic, I would probably feel at least somewhat comfortable, somewhat at home going to Mass in my local Catholic parish in Argentina. And that's something you can't say about all religions. I mean, if I'm a Methodist and I move to Thailand, I mean, there's probably not a Methodist congregation there. And even if there is, they might be very different, you know? But Catholics, like, they're kind of all around the world. And they're, again, fairly consistent in their messaging. So I would count that as my last point of Steelmanning in favor of Catholicism. This next one I got, I think it's a joke. I've never actually heard this argument, but I was going to throw it in anyway because I think it's entertaining. Someone said the Bible is actually from the future. And then they said, you can't prove it won't happen. So I have not heard this argument before, but if the book is from the future, it actually makes a lot more sense why so many of the prophecies, like those around the Messiah, haven't come to pass. Now, granted, maybe that's not Steelmanning because the Christian answer is that all the prophecies did come to pass. But I'm like, if someone wants to tell me that the book's from the future, that would answer a lot of questions, you know? Also, I am no friend of like creationists, for example, but whenever we're talking about like creationism or whenever we're talking about prophecy for that matter, there are deep, endless discussions that happen around biblical timelines because people try to make things work according to what was written thousands of years ago. And sometimes they'll say, well, you know, this passage said it would be 40 days, and we know that 40 days passed and it didn't happen. But if we assume that 40 is a century, suddenly, oh, now I can line this up to today. You know, like they'll come up with these conversion factors to say, well, this period of time isn't really a day, and it's not really an hour, and it's not really a year. It's actually 7 years, or it's 700 years, or it's 1,000 years, or whatever. But if all of this is in the future, I guess it would answer a lot of those questions. Because ultimately, God's time scale may not be equivalent to our time scale. This is a side conversation that we won't get into today, but you know, this is how a lot of people try to square the narratives in books like Genesis, because they say, well, God's days aren't just our days. You know, they weren't 24-hour periods. A day might be millennia. It might be an epoch. It could be a lot of different things. So this would all make a lot more sense if the Bible's from the future. The next thing we're Steelmanning is Pascal's wager. So before I dive into this, I have to say that I've been meaning to put out a new video on belief. I did a belief months ago where I talked about how you can't make someone believe something they don't want to believe. But admittedly, I need to redo that or do a new version on that, an updated version, because, well, I still know, I don't believe, I know that you can't just change your beliefs because you want to. I will also say that there's a scale that you have to take into account. Okay. If we assume a scale from like 1 to 5, 1 means you believe something totally, and 5 means you absolutely do not believe it. So, like, I am the number 5 atheist, meaning I have no reason to believe in a God. I don't think anyone can convince me otherwise at this point. There are, of course, people in the middle of that scale, the 2s and the 3s and the 4s, people who have not solidified positive or negative on a given decision. And for those people, they are swayable, they are influenceable, because they're starting to doubt their beliefs, or they're an atheist and they're starting to think, well, maybe something's there. The point is that they are not at the extreme ends of the scale. They're somewhere in the middle. If you're really somewhere in the middle, then it means that you are probably more open to arguments and discussions pro or con on that subject. And I bring this up with regard to Pascal's wager because here's the deal. Here's the most important steelman that I can give you for Pascal's wager. Pascal's wager is not for hardcore atheists. It's easy for hardcore atheists to pull up Pascal's wager and say this is patently and logically ridiculous. But I don't think Pascal's wager was ever meant for those people like me. Pascal's wager, I think, is a tool. It's essentially a tool of apologists. It's a tool for those who are, generally speaking, believing, but they've started to have doubts. And they've started to say, I don't know if all this adds up. I'm not sure. So in other words, they still pretty much believe in God. In fact, you could even argue they want to believe in God, but they're dealing with a few doubts. They're feeling some struggles. And how do they process that? And even though I don't like Pascal's wager at all, I will be the first one to tell you that if we are going to find a situation in which Pascal's wager makes any sense, in which I can steelman it, it is in the context of people who still mostly believe, who still really want to believe, but they're just struggling with some doubts. For those people, you can say, look, yeah, we'll deal with the doubts. Let's talk through them and let's try to get you past that. But also keep in mind that there's this simple mathematical decision matrix that you can use to say, why would you even allow your mind to go down that path? That is, I think, the most logical use of Pascal's wager. For someone who's already at the other end of the path, for someone like me who said, there's not a God, this is ridiculous. Pascal's wager is a joke. It's silly. It's illogical. But for the person who's been in your church for 20 years and they've been, saying the prayers and going through the motions, and now they're just starting to articulate a handful of doubts, I think that if you assume the goal is to keep them in the faith, then that is the best, most logical use of Pascal's wager. Okay, a few more here. The second to last, we're going to just talk in general about prime mover arguments. And there's a whole bunch of these. And I find it weird sometimes how Christians have found like 10 different ways to make these different arguments for God. And when you look at them, they're all part of the same family. They are prime mover arguments. So, for example, one classic argument is, well, everything that exists was created or caused to exist by something else. So, I was caused to exist by my parents, and my parents were caused to exist by their parents, and blah, blah, blah. So it creates this chain. The desk here was created out of molecules and raw materials, which were in turn created by trees and other things that put the raw materials together. And you keep following this back, right? This is often referred to in sneering terms as turtles all the way down. And while I do not subscribe to these arguments, I will tell you that if I'm going to steelman prime mover arguments, before I try to steelman it, first I'm going to ask you a question. How much do you think that you can perceive of the idea of infinity? Now, I'm going to say this knowing that there is no human that I know of who can truly perceive an infinite. Our brains did not evolve to perceive infinities. In the nature that we perceive around us, infinities, at least initially, don't seem to exist. We see a beginning and an end. We see time on a linear scale. We see a creator in the creation. This is a normal observation for people just looking around their environment. And through millions of years, yes, creationists, millions of years, our species, along with probably every other species on the planet that has achieved any intelligence, has evolved to understand the natural world that they can perceive around them, and that does not involve infinities. Where am I going with this? Here's the deal. If you cannot accept an infinity, if you cannot perceive or even begin to perceive of an infinity, then yeah, I guess every prime mover argument you come up with, which by the way, they're all kind of the same argument, they all sort of make sense. Now, I could sit here and be snarky with you and say, well, you believe that the initial prime mover is God. And of course, the standard atheist response is, okay, but who made God? Oh, he doesn't have to be made. He's outside time and space. Okay, now we've gotten to special pleading. But I'll grant you that for this discussion. I'm not going to go into that here because I'm trying to steelman your argument. And if I'm steelmanning it, I'm going to say, hey, do you think that infinities are possible? I bring this up because if we assume that everything that came had to be made by something else, then you're going to always assume something came before it. And then at some point, you're going to have to create special pleading to say, here's the thing, God or whatever, that didn't have to be made before it. But if you shift your mind a little bit, I'm not going to say that I have this totally in my mind either, because I don't think any human can, but not everything is a linear scale. Not everything is a series of dominoes. You know, it's like the old question of what's north of the North Pole. Nothing's north of the North Pole. It's a stupid question to ask what's north of the North Pole. So if you ask what came before the Big Bang, what came before creation, which, by the way, the Big Bang, no scientist believes that the Big Bang was the beginning of the universe. Even though a lot of creationists want to tell you this, they believe that the Big Bang was the beginning of the expansion of the universe. But that's a whole other issue. Again, we're trying to steelman here. If you can admit that you cannot conceive of how infinities can actually be present in time and space, then fine. Pick whatever prime mover argument you want. It's that simple. That is the best steelman that I can give for any prime mover argument, is that it's a question that you have to ask yourself. Can you even, on some level, conceptually believe that infinities are possible? Because if you can believe that they're possible, then you don't need a prime mover. But if you believe that infinities in any way, shape, or form cannot be, then at some point you're going to stick a prime mover into your equation. And here's our last steelman. So the last thing I got before I closed off, started making this video, was for me to steelman Calvinism. I thought this was very interesting. I grew up in West Michigan, which has a huge Dutch population. You might think, what does that have to do with anything? Well, Calvinism is very big amongst the Dutch community. So I was raised with a lot of exposure to Reformed, in Reformed churches. I also went to Presbyterian churches, which are heavily influenced by Calvinism. I find Calvinism to be kind of fascinating. All right. So There are many aspects to Calvinism, and I'm not going to do a deep dive on Calvinism here. This video is already long. Normally, when people really start diving into Calvinism and debating its merits, what they're really talking about is predeterminism. As a quick primer, if you didn't know this already, Calvinists, like pure Calvinists or whatever, believe that God knows all things, truly all things. Calvinists typically believe in free will, although that's a weird, sticky thing to talk about because they also believe that essentially at the moment you were born, God already knew if you're going to be saved, that your grace, your eternal soul was determined at the point you were born and determined by God, which is kind of funny to me because, first of all, Calvinists don't want to tell you this, but it sounds a whole lot like materialistic determinism. I mean, they'll tell you it's not the same, but that's a funny conversation to have. But here's my Steelmanning of this. Even if we assume the Calvinist position that predeterminism is real, even if we assume that God knew at the moment you came out of the womb whether or not you were going to be saved or whether or not you were going to burn in hell. That sounds really unfair, doesn't it? But here's a couple things to keep in mind. First of all, determinism is really something that only makes sense when you try to think at this truly universal cosmic scale, all right? Even if my future is totally set, if I don't know that future, and if I don't know the things that I will say or do that will lead me to that future, then from my perspective, in my context, it's not determined. In other words, this whole idea of determinism depends a lot on what level or what scale you're looking at. So, for example, you can put an ant in a maze, right? And I can put some apple or something at the end of the maze. And I know that with the ant's senses, it will eventually find its way through the maze. Now, looking at it from up here, I know that the ant is going to find its way through. I may not know myself every turn it will take, but I know that it's going to get its way to that apple at the end. To the ant, they don't know that. I mean, they're getting a sense of something and they're trying to find it. They don't know if they're ever going to find it. They don't know if it's even there. Maybe by the time they get there, it'll have been picked up by another scavenger. So from their perspective, it's not deterministic. They're just making their decisions as they go around their ant paths and trying to find the food. I really believe that a lot of determinism, a lot of these discussions around determinism rely a lot on what level we're zoomed in at. That may sound like a bit of mental trickery because you might say, well, at the cosmic scale, if it's all determined, then if you zoom in closer and you don't see the determinism, that doesn't mean it's not there. But I would say that from the perspective of those people or those ants that only have access to the small amount of data, it's true that they have free will. I don't want to go too much into this because there's whole other videos to be done on this. But this is, to me, the best way to steelman Calvinism because this idea of determinism really only applies if you are God. Now, you could argue, well, the point of religion and theology is to try to think about these things like what does God think or what does God want? But ultimately, if we're trying to figure out how this affects our daily lives, it has no impact whatsoever. The last thing I will say with regard to steelmanning Calvinism is that ultimately where Calvinism gets really sticky is this idea that you're going to burn in hell for something that God knew you were going to do from the moment that you came out of the womb. That's pretty hard to deal with. I don't have a great steelman answer for you on that other than to say this. When I was a Christian, as I've talked about earlier, I was much more of an annihilationist. So if you tell me that God knew when I popped out of the womb that I was going to be an atheist, and there's no way I was going to get to heaven, and that when I died, I was going to poof, go away, I'd say, okay, I can accept that. Now, I understand a lot of people won't accept that. In fact, the majority, I think the vast majority of Calvinists believe in eternal conscious torment. I don't know how to steelman that. Because if you believe in eternal conscious torment, but you also believe that from the time you were born, God already knew if you were going to burn in hell, I don't know what to say about that. But again, my steelman argument for this would be, but you're not going to burn in hell. You'll just go away. And if you're just going to go away, there may be reasons to have these people on earth. If you're working from the omniscient perspective of God, who won't go to heaven, but they might perform functions that are necessary for humanity or necessary for the edification of the saved or what have you. And as long as the punishment for that is not that they have to have eternal conscious torment, I could get behind that to some extent. So these are my steelman arguments for bad Christian defenses. They're not all bad Christian defenses, but that was the original premise under which I solicited feedback. I hope you've enjoyed some of these. I have actually tried in good faith to present arguments that I can still live with as an atheist, and I still think make at least as much sense as possible. It doesn't mean I'm converting, but I think that sometimes this is more valuable than just trying to say Christian bad or Yahweh stupid or, religion evil. I think it helps to try to work through what the arguments for and against any position are. And not just whatever arguments people will throw at you, but if I had to defend this, how would I defend it? So these are the ways that I would defend these things. Thank you for being here. I hope that you've enjoyed this video. I hope you've liked and subscribed and shared it with all your friends. Super thanks to our members. You guys are giving me life. I appreciate you all. I hope to see you on future videos, but until I do, lo, I say unto you, stay skeptical.